having just returned from San Diego Comic-Con for 2022, I got a big question to ask you. If you had to pick one superpower that you could have, what would the superpower be? Super strength, the ability to fly. The ability to walk through walls like Kitty Pryde. Colossus, your body turns to steel. Ben Grimm, you turn into a giant rock monster that no one can love except for that one woman in the 80s. What other superpowers? Green Lantern, the ability to fight everything except for a banana. What would you like to do? What would you like to have, Brad? What would be your superpower?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is invisibility, but not for the reasons that people usually give. Like they always say
to be a creep.
right. But mine is actually exactly the opposite. I would just like to disappear. Especially I spent the last week up with my family, and by the way, I've got to be very careful now because now my mom has figured out how to listen to the podcast. So I've got to be very careful on what I say.
So everyone knows now be 38% less cussing on the podcast.
That's right. If not 39%. But I found out my ability for small talk has waned over the years, and I found myself doing an awful lot of that because what happens when you see family members and cousins that you haven't seen for an awful long time?
Right.
It very quickly goes into small talk.
Yes.
And I would have given anything for invisibility, just not for the entire day, just for like a 10-minute little break, just to not say, so how is the weather in Portland? What do you get a lot of rain there, do you?
So is the oxygen different in northern Michigan?
I often wonder, how now are the Great Lakes, are they still, I figure pretty good?
So you got those shoes at Foot Locker, you say? All right, yeah.
I'm not good at small talk. So the first one that comes to mind is invisibility, just so I can take a break for 10 minutes at a time and recharge my social battery. What about you?
Oh my God. I love that both of our superpower choices are the choices of middle-aged men that kind of just want to be left alone. My superpower choice, Brad, is the ability to stop time for everyone but me. And here's my thought behind this. I have daydreamt about this for years. I would love to be able to, when starting a project, stop time. There's no phone calls. There's no emails. I can just put my head down and draw. Oh, no one's bothered me. I don't have to make dinner for anybody. Oh, I can just draw, Brad. I can just draw. Yeah. And then, oh, look, I'm done with the page. I'm going to start time back up again. And look, I've lost no time. I'm right back into it. I can go for bike rides with the kids. I can throw a ball around. I can do it. Like I could basically live double lives with the ability to stop time.
Wasn't that a Twilight Zone episode at one point? Somebody who could stop time?
Both the classic Twilight Zone had it with the guy with the stopwatch, and then there was when they redid the Twilight Zone in the 80s, they had the woman who stopped time right in the midst of a nuclear war. Remember her? And there's a Russian missile coming down at her head. She's like, well, now what do I do? And so the other secret superpower I want, Brad, is, do you remember Multiple Man? Do you remember the ability to just pop identical versions of yourself into existence? And that to me sounds wonderful. If I could have 4 Daves around the studio just doing a bunch of tasks, like, all right, you do penciling, you do lettering, all right, you're going to lay out this page, all right, you're going to write the next 4 pages of Drive, you're going to answer a bunch of emails. That seems wonderful to me. Having 5 people that are all me doing this task, I think that would be wonderful.
Multi-Dave, that would be a wonderful superhero. Multi-Dave.
Multi-Dave,
Totally
unfortunately, more mouths to feed. I'd now have to make more dinners, but there you go. That's. But did Multiple Man have the ability to just kind of reabsorb them? What would he have to do?
Yes. And in fact, probably one of the most popular iterations of that was Duplicate, who was part of the Invincible universe.
Yeah.
And she could multiply and then reabsorb all of those iterations of herself.
That was fun. The one I always appreciated from a writing standpoint was Alpha Flight had one where he would basically pull different versions of him from time, if that makes sense. But when one got killed, they all disappeared because he was the earliest iteration of them. Does that make sense?
Oh,
so
wow.
if the Brad from 3 days ago got pulled into to existence right now, but that Brad got killed, then all the versions of Brad Geiger got killed because all the future ones would get killed as well. Anyway, it was a great writing idea for that bit of fun. Anyway, I don't know why I got into that, so I'm just going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics
and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, the author of the Webcomics Handbook and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We got a big show today talking about San Diego Comic-Con, the first one in 3 years. But before we get into that, I just want to mention you could be watching this show live right now with our live Gab pals over at patreon.com/ComicLab. We have a special level that you can jump in on and watch the live stream show every week. There's also a running and concurrent chat going where people are sharing tips and trips. Sharing tips and trips. Oh, I tell you what, I fell on Tuesday. What a great... I just wanted to share that with the group.
You should have. Nobody. I slipped on the ice. Nobody made fun of me, but the ice made a couple of cracks.
Hey, Zingo. Anyway, so you can join us over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And Brad, let's jump into it.
Oh, yeah.
Comic-Con, the first one to happen since 2019. And it was a weird and wonderful event. I have to say, I really enjoyed going. It was a fun one.
Now, this was your first time back at any convention since the pandemic started. And we purposefully have not talked too much about it up until now because I'm desperate to find out everything that happened. And the first question on my list was because I'll just tell it right off the bat. If I would have been making your decisions for you, I would have advised against doing this show. I was very, very nervous going in. When you said that you had paid your deposit, I'm like, all right, my fingers are crossed for you. But now let's find out. Would I have steered you in the right direction or would I have steered you in the wrong direction?
First of all, no. Had I made the decision the day before the show, I probably would not have done it. It was not.
Really?
Let's be absolutely honest about it. Yeah. From a immunological standpoint, it was not a wise decision to do that show. 100,000 people in one big room. BA5 has the transmissibility rate of almost of measles, which is bonkers transmissible, right?
Wow.
And so it is not a good time to be doing a Comic-Con. But I had plunked down the cash, and you remember on the show, folks remember listening. I had made the decision. I think it was around April, Brad. And the rates have really cratered, at least in Los Angeles and Southern California. And I was like, you know what? I'm feeling like it's going to be okay. And then, as has happened a million times during COVID, we get thrown a curveball. So had I made the decision a week beforehand, I don't know that I would have plunked down the cash and gone with it. But I sort of had gotten a Rolling Stone moving that I couldn't stop at a certain point, where I was just
one of those Rolling Stones that gathers moss.
Yes, as Brad Geiger has famously put into phrase there. Yes. So I had a Rolling Stone that was gathering so much moss, Brad. Oh, it was so much moss had it gathered. Oh, the moss all over the stone.
Yes.
Anyway, no. So I had too many lives involved and too many things going on where I had to. I didn't have to. I could have stopped at any point, but I decided, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to trust my N95s and my in-booth massive HEPA filter from Honeywell. And so I did the show. And I have to say, to San Diego Comic-Con's great credit, they had a mask mandate and a health mandate in terms of vaccines that they instituted. And in a way that I have only seen at hospitals, I would say 95 to 98% of people were wearing masks and were wearing high quality masks. Not even cloth masks, but medical or N95 or better. And so I was really, really, really chuffed about how good it was with the mask wearing, because we're sort of making a social compact. Like, this is not a good idea. We have 100,000 people in one big room. Let's all, as fellow nerds, let's make a social compact that like, look, we all are readers. We all are fairly intelligent folks. We all can stand with the science on this and say masks help. Let's wear the mask. So yes, there were some grumblings, but for the most part, everybody wore them, and I was very happy about that. So was it a wise decision? I don't think it was, but I sure did enjoy the show having gone to it.
Yeah. Was it financially successful for you?
Oh, Bradley! Oh, we need to talk, Bradley.
Really?
Oh, Brad, do you have about 40 minutes to spare? So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the show, I think what happened was psychologically, everyone had this pent up, I'm going to treat myself kind of a feeling. Yeah. You know what I mean? In the same way, like, you know, when you haven't gone on a vacation in 4 or 5 years and then you're like, so this vacation, it's a margarita every night. I'm having a fun vacation. And so I think that's what it was for everybody. This was a lot of people's first hurrah in the pandemic, or only for hurrah, like in my case. And so a lot of people were really cracking the wallets and also just supporting that. I think there were a lot of people that just had made the choice to say, I want to support. And also, I have had a productive pandemic in the fact that I had 3 new books over the pandemic and a bunch of other stuff, the pins and another tchotchkes. So there was a fair amount to plunk down. So I would have readers come up and be like, I'll take these 4 books, that original art, these 2 pins. And, you know, those are big purchases when those happen. So it was a very productive show. I think I beat my best. I haven't done the final math on it, but I beat my best Comic-Con by $1,500, I think, on this show.
Wow.
Yeah,
so how much of that do you think was return, like people that already knew you and had bought from you in the past and just was like, well, I've got 3 years of catching up to do, so I'm going to take this, this, and this.
Yeah, it was a lot of that. I think as you could probably intuit, I think most of the purchases, 80, maybe even 90% were return, and then 20 or 10% were discovery. So make of that what you will, but most of them are return. But what's interesting is most of them are return from previous Comic-Cons, meaning they were discoveries in previous years at Comic-Con. Because they would say it. I found you at Comic-Con 4 years ago, and I've been coming ever since. All that sort of thing. And so I guess you could kind of count that as a discovery, but it's a return visit nonetheless. Yeah. So it was also, Brad, the first time that we've given away the ComicLab appearance pin. It's a free pin you get when you see Brad or Dave in an event, and it says, "Let's talk comics." And we gave it out at the booth to everyone that came up as a listener. And I got to tell you, it was so fun to meet all these ComicLab listeners for all around the world. So, Brad, just for clarity's sake, when did we start the podcast?
Oh, gosh, we're in our 5th year this year.
5th year. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know that we have done a ton of public events.
No.
Since we started the show. So this sort of felt like the belle of the ball soiree, you know, what do they call it in the South when they have the sort of
debutante ball?
Yeah, it felt like the debutante ball for the podcast in the sense that a lot of people, we had cartoonists, professionals from all aspects of the industry. We had academics, we had journalists, we had animators from Pixar, from Warner Brothers, from Nickelodeon. We had listeners from the U.S., from Canada, from Mexico, from Germany, and it was so fun. And we gave out the pin. And by the way, if you are ever wanting to get the pin, the next appearance that we're going to be giving that puppy out, Brad, this is exciting. Why don't you tell everybody what that one is?
Our next official, and we're both going to be there. The next official ComicLab appearance is going to be November 12th at the Schulz Museum. They're having Dave and I come out special to do a live recording of the ComicLab podcast in honor of Charles Schulz's, what would have been his 100th birthday. They're planning a big celebration. They've got some other events going on there as well. But Dave and I are going to kick off the day with an afternoon presentation of our show. So if you're a ComicLab listener, you definitely want to head out on November 12th to the Schulz Museum because we're going to be hanging out there doing the show. We'll probably do a ComicLab meetup. There's going to be all kinds of stuff going on out there, and you don't want to miss it.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. I would imagine if the fates are smiling, we will do a museum walk around, either officially sanctioned by the museum or we'll just as pals, we'll all go around together. Yeah. And then we'll definitely probably go out to a beer garden and see if we can't get Brad a box of wine somehow.
Yes.
Then I think it's just going to be a dang delight. There's also a second panel, which we can't talk about who's on the second panel right after us, but let's just say it's a big national name that you'll know from television. And it's going to be a really fun thing. It's almost only the second time we've done a live podcast recording.
Yeah.
We did one in Long Beach, I think it was, Brad. Remember the Long Beach Comic-Con?
We did the Long Beach one. I think we did one at your house that same weekend.
Oh, that's true. But
did.
That's not really in front of a live studio audience. It's going to be special, though, because the museum is gorgeous. The Charles Schulz Museum is gorgeous. The auditorium that they have is gorgeous. Don't forget Sparky's Ice Ring is right across the way. Yep. There are wine tasting places all around Santa Rosa. So if you want to make a vacation out of it, it's going to be a fun time. November 12th, you should really, really plan for it.
Absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Santa Rosa, California. It sounds like it's a beautiful, beautiful place to be. So, Dave, you said we had cartoonists, academics, journalists, people from other countries, and they were, I'm sure, asking about me. What did you tell them when they said, how's Brad doing? Where is he? Tell us a little something about Brad. What kinds of things came up in those conversations?
I didn't tell anyone about the discrete mold that only you and I know about. No, one of my favorite bits would be when someone would come up and be like, "Oh wow, I love the show," and I always would say something to the effect of, "Even the parts with Brad? All right, well, great."
Boy, you've got a high tolerance for crap, don't you?
Yeah. No, it was lovely, and it's so everyone on listening to the show can relate because we're all creators, and it's a uniquely fun thing to put faces to readers or listeners in this case of people that are enjoying your work. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone that came out. It meant the world to me. It was rejuvenating on my heart, as was all of San Diego Comic-Con. It was rejuvenating. It was enlivening. It was energizing. I was so happy to meet you all. And they were really nice, fun people from such a wide variety of cartooning, storyboard artists, colorists, animators, letterers, people at Marvel, DC, Image, people working independent in Webtoons, Tapas on their own stuff. It was really fun to meet them all, Brad.
Wonderful. Well, listen, this is something I've been thinking about asking you for a long time. And that is the fact that you've been doing this show for years and years and years, right?
Yes,
You've been doing this show for a long time. How has the show changed? What was the feel this year? Or was it like going back to the same old San Diego, or have there been certain changes that you noticed?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I have been doing San Diego Comic-Con since, and I forgive my memory, it's either 98 or 99.
Wow.
And those first ones were very much just dipping a toe. I didn't really know what I was doing, in those first years. But anyway, so I've been going for over 24, 23 years at this point. And I love the show. For me, I've got it down pat. I know how to do San Diego, but the show around me is changing. And Brad sensed this even when you were still doing the show. Is that the show every year feels a little bit more corporate-y and a little less artisty, and that keeps happening. And I think it's just getting too expensive for the average artist to try to make a profit there. The booths are just too expensive. San Diego as a city, the hotel rates they're not cheap. And as we all know, because of jet fuel prices and also price gouging, that flights are expensive as heck right now. So you could easily drop thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to exhibit at San Diego and bring home $100. Bring home nothing. Right. You might be in the hole. So I get it. And so what I'm finding is, Brad, there's no longer, when we were younger, when we were in our 20s, there were 4 or 5 rows of 20-year-old cartoonists exhibiting and selling to other 20-year-olds. And I look around now as an older cartoonist and I don't see that. And it makes me sad because that's the lifeblood of the next generation of cartoons. That's where frankly, all the Webtoons cartoonists, all the Tapas cartoonists should be at Comic-Con. They should be at Comic-Con. Right. I'm saying if the conditions were right, they should be at Comic-Con. They should be meeting their fans. Some of those people have millions of readers. They should be meeting their fans and they're not there. And to me, what that feels like is it feels like an old growth forest. Where, you've got all these huge established sequoias. You've got your Batman. You've got your Image. You've got your Iron Man over here. You've got your Funko Pop. You've got, Disney Plus, whatever massive sequoia you want to talk about. Yeah. But they have blocked out all the undergrowth. So there's nothing new coming up at San Diego in the sense that in the way that there was 20 years ago, there's no 20-year-olds exhibiting anymore. Yeah. They can't afford it. They don't do it. They don't even think that that's on their radar. And it's a I think it's a real shame for the future of comics that it's become so corporate that an average independent artist, can't get a booth. And if they can, they can't afford it. And if they can't afford it, well, then they're not making much of a profit, you know?
Right. Even in Artist Alley, where I typically go to at a typical comic convention to see up and coming people, independents, people who are trying new things, doing something out of the ordinary. Even Artist Alley, from what you told me, was pretty much established creators, correct?
Oh, yeah. I'm guessing here. I'm putting a ballpark number. Let's say there's 100 people in Artist Alley.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the right number. But out of those 100, of course, because it's juried selection, there's going to be some interesting new people. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But my eye very much caught on to the fact that there are a lot of Marvel artists in Artist Alley. There's a lot of DC artists in Artist Alley. There's a lot of Image artists in Artist Alley. All fine and good. That's, they should be there. But I didn't see any up and coming 20-year-olds with the new title or with the breakout webtoons hit. And so I don't know what to make of that. I'm still kind of processing what that means for comics. I think what it means is that more and more careers are being made entirely online. Not just that they're finding their audiences, but they're also monetizing through Kickstarter and through Patreon, mainly Patreon, in a way that did not exist 20 years ago. And that maybe is a better substitute. However, it just makes an old schooler like me sad that they don't get to experience that Comic-Con, joy of like setting up a table and meeting 100 people a day that love your work.
And speaking of things that are no longer there, no longer are the 20-somethings there. Also, no longer is the webcomics sign there. I hear they took the sign for webcomics down.
Yeah,
and I remember being so excited when I showed up there on the show floor and saw webcomics right there. We were right underneath the sign. And it was like a certain feeling of having arrived, of having been established. That sign is no longer gone. I wondered if you had some thoughts as to why that would be.
Well, when it went up, it felt like a certain, because, you look for this when you're younger. It felt like a certain validation that like, okay, the National Cartoonist Society is not letting us in. Right. Okay, the newspaper folks all hate us. Okay, Image and DC and Marvel folks think we're a joke. But we are making great livings and we're starting to build careers and and then the webcomic section going up at Comic-Con felt like, all right, somebody gets it. Somebody sees that there is an audience for this and that it's working. And so it felt wonderful to have that go up. And then to have it go down was sort of a sad denouement of like, well, I guess that's over because you don't see Ryan North anymore, Jeff Jackson anymore, or Penny Arcade or Scott Kurtz or Meredith Grand or anybody that we came up with. Would never consider going to Comic-Con anymore. They just wouldn't go anymore. And so that whole section, which again, used to be 4 or 5 solid rows of just webcomic after webcomic after webcomic. It was really fun in your 20s to go to Comic-Con because you also knew there were at least 5,000 readers of just webcomics that were going to San Diego Comic-Con just to see these people. And if you could get a hold of them, you could probably convince them to read your webcomic too. There was an excitement to that. And that's gone now.
And those were often the best after parties too, not for nothing. Those were often the best places to go afterwards. So we talked about going into the show that there was a lot of booths selling and centered around NFT. Did you happen to check in on them? Did they have crowds at their booths? What was the feel at the NFT booths?
I gave them only a passing glance because thankfully, I think this weird flash in the pan is dying, and I tried not to give it too much of my mental space. But I honestly couldn't tell what the hell was going on there. I literally I couldn't tell what the business model was at the booth, if you know what I mean. I think it was just a promo expense that they had undertaken, and at that point just had to keep going with. But I will say this, Brad, though, in terms of walking around and looking at booths. Because of COVID, this was the first year that I saw this happen. So for everyone that doesn't know, San Diego Comic-Con has been going on in the 70s, since the 70s in San Diego. Hugely popular comic convention, gets a global audience that flies in from all over the world. The farthest readers I think I had this year were from Japan. And gets people from all over the world, all walks of life. And it really is sort of the big show along with New York Comic-Con for comics. And when you get in, you sort of stay in because the booths are so hard to get. So I say all that only to set this up. which is for the first time ever, Brad, I saw 4 empty booths walking around San Diego Comic-Con in the first 2 days of the show. And the most interesting thing, and I think kind of like a tragic story behind it, was a booth that was empty, but all the boxes had been shipped and placed by the union in the booth, which there is no, that's like for sale baby shoes never worn. That there's a story there, and it's not a happy story of like someone took the time to buy the booths, took the time to ship the stuff, and then did not come. And there's no happy ending to that story.
Did that person ever make it? Because I remember you texted me a photo, and I so immediately I was in the car driving to Michigan with my wife at that point. She was behind the wheel. And so I had some time to kill. So I immediately started looking this person up. So I looked at their Twitter feed, their website, this, that. Everything was like, yeah, see you in San Diego. This is great. We'll see you there. Nothing that said, hey, we've changed plans or anything like that. It was all full steam ahead with San Diego. And I was just curious as to whether they just never showed up.
No, I think the best that I could figure what happened there, the booth did get used on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but by somebody else. So I think they sold it on.
Really?
Yeah, which is, and I say this only because this never happens in San Diego that there are booths empty. Never happens. And I counted 4, maybe even 5 booths that were empty. And so either someone caught it right before they were going to get to the show, or just had a second thought in the way that I was having a second thought in the week before the show. But there's no happy twist to that. Also, I think the overall population of the show, Brad, for the first time in years, felt smaller than previous Comic-Cons. I felt like there were 10 to 15% less people at Comic-Con than in 2019. And that's an interesting contrast because my sales were up 10 to 15%, maybe 20%. I don't know. I got to do the math on that. But my population, my readers coming to the booth, my per sale profit thing was there were a less number of people coming by. So it was an interesting show for a lot of reasons. It was a weird Comic-Con, but it was fun to go to, but it was a weird Comic-Con wearing that N95 for 12 hours a day.
Yeah, we saw lots of Marvel announcements coming out. Now, in the past, Disney had kind of retracted from San Diego to do their own show. So does that mean that Disney had a presence at this show again?
Oh, my God. Yeah. We made a big talk about this on 2018, I think, because Disney had basically pulled out of Comic-Con. They're like, D23, that's the place to be, kids. We're gonna go big on D23. And listen, you, me, and the wall know that D23 does well. It does fine by Disney. Yeah. But something in their marketing meetings were like, nah, we still got to do Comic-Con, because this year Disney Plus was there, Disney Publishing was there, Marvel was there in a big way. Disney, something else, Disney merch was there. There was like 5 different big Disney booths when there had been none in 2018, 2019. So they came back to Comic-Con in a big way. Funko bought out a good 1/40th of the Comic-Con. They had a huge display. And in a way, that sort of is what making it feel more and more corporate-y, because there's less of the, hey, I'm setting up my vinyl sign behind me and plopping down my books and selling, and more of a, hey, here's 20 employees setting up a rigid wall booth that you can walk through that has, a full merch display. So anyway, it was fun to see Disney come back, but it's also a bit like, no, I wish that was more artists in those spaces. But what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I can't change that, Right. Yeah, and I've got a feeling that's gonna be the direction as years go on. It's just going to get more like that. I don't think we're going to see those independent artists coming back. And one thing that I would like to talk about, because I've said a couple of times in the show that I had a tremendous time. It was very fun. It was enriching to be at the show. It was financially very worthwhile for me to go to the show. But I want to say that I continue to think, as does Brad, that conventions are probably not something the average cartoonist wants to do or should do. Right. Maybe just to better say should do. I don't know that the average cartoonist can do what I can do at San Diego and make a big profit on it, because let's lay this out so that it's very clear for people. I live in Los Angeles. My family is from San Diego. I can drive down to San Diego and stay at a family place. Don't have to pay for a hotel. Don't have to pay for a flight. Don't have to pay for shipping. I throw it all in the back of my Honda Odyssey, and I'm down there, later that day. It's basically gas and meals for me at Comic-Con. And granted, a $4,000 booth. Like, the booths are expensive if you're getting a corner booth at Comic-Con. But my costs are limited. And so it's very easy for me to make my profit back multiple times on my expenses. That is not true of the average person. Shipping stuff across transnationally to Comic-Con from the East Coast, Brad can tell you that can knock you sideways. Oh,
well, and not only was it, even though I would often use media mail and just cram boxes full of books and ship it media mail, even that that poundage added up very quickly, and it was just tiring. It took a long time to load that stuff up, to get it packed in there so that it wasn't going to explode on the trip over. How many of those books got damaged during the process as well? Right. So it was long, expensive, time-consuming, heavy work, and then again, very often, if you don't sell, you've got to ship enough so that you don't miss that opportunity if you do catch fire. But what happens? You've got a whole bunch of books left over. Now you got to ship it back home. To add insult into injury, you got to ship that stuff back home now. Not only is that expensive and backbreaking and everything else, now you're not at your home base. It's incredibly complicated. Or you just pay through the nose and do it right there on the show floor. One way or the other, it's a real mess.
And, the show, for those that don't know, runs 5 days, Wednesday through Sunday. I, in Los Angeles, can leave Wednesday morning. I wake up normal Wednesday morning. I get myself a cup of coffee, and then 2 hours later, I'm down in San Diego, right? Yeah. Brad has to leave the day before the show starts and has to return the day after. So Brad's losing 7 days of work to go to this show where he may or may not be able, because of East Coast costs, to make a profit. So all of this is to say, even though I made a great profit at San Diego, I do not recommend it for the average person to try to go. There's a reason why I don't do New York Comic Con. There's a reason why I don't do TCAP. Those expenses will knock you sideways. And also, it's just a hassle to do all those extra days of travel to go from West Coast to East Coast or East Coast to West Coast. It's not worth it. So even though you hear me speaking with loving words about San Diego and how much I will do that show forever, it's because of my very specific conditions that I don't recommend necessarily work for you.
Oh, yeah. And if you want to hear more on that topic, we devoted an entire show to exhibiting at comic conventions. And I think the first words out of my mouth was, in terms of giving advice to somebody who wants to exhibit at a comic convention, is don't do it. Don't do it. It's probably a bad decision. So if you want more information, listen to that show. We line it up pretty good. Right. But if you want the short version, it's very simple. Do the math. Yeah. All that stuff that Dave was talking about lines up basically to math. Counting all of your expenses, all of them, travel, food, hotel, shipping, count up all your expenses, and then ask yourself, how likely is it that I'm going to sell enough that I'm going to make a profit? If you've got books that you kickstarted, that's great, because those are pure profit. If you are printing stuff to take to the convention, or paying to have stuff manufactured to take to the convention, those are not pure profit. You've got to subtract the cost for that and make that part of your overall cost. It's not a great decision for 90% of the independent cartoonists and artists out there. It's not a good call for you to do that. But if you're thinking about it, do the math. Do that math first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say this too, because in addition to my very specific geographics and financials that helped me out with San Diego Comic-Con, I should say that because I have two very different titles, Drive and Sheldon, that's also really instructive to teach me that not every title does well at Comic-Con. And I'll tell you what I mean. my most recent Drive Kickstarter did gangbusters. It was like $120,000, $130,000, right? My most recent Sheldon Kickstarter did like 1/3 of that, I think, at best, right? Sheldon does not do great and compared to Drive in terms of income online. But at Comic-Con, good God, Drive does or Sheldon does gangbusters at Comic-Con, and Drive doesn't do anything. And it's the weirdest thing. Like at best, Drive did like $800 worth of sales, right? Like nothing. Wow. And so, but Sheldon, good God, did gangbusters. And so, especially
those pug books.
Oh my God, those pug books, Brad. The pug book alone is like $4,000. So anyway, so the what was I going to say? What I'm getting at is, it is really weird and instructive to me, and there's no way that I can teach this to other people, but just that not every title does well in person on a table at a show. Sheldon, for whatever reason, does bonkers at a show, even though it doesn't do great on Kickstarter. Drive does terrible at a show, even though it does great on Kickstarter and Patreon. Like, it's a unique thing about, and I think, Brad, in all fairness, you kind of found that with Evil Inc., that it's a hard sell. It's great to sell on Patreon, great to sell on Kickstarters, doesn't do so well at a show, right?
Oh, absolutely. I would never go back and try to do that again. Like I've said this in the past, I think if I did any show in the future, if I was going to go to a show, the one requirement would be that it not be a comic convention. I would have to be at a show that I was the only comic on the floor. Then I could see maybe that kind of novelty would give me an edge. But to be there doing especially a superhero comic and to try to sell that on the floor of a comic convention, all of those other stuff that we talked about was absolutely true. Plus, I was competing with 100 people doing the same thing, and at that point, when somebody walks in, you've got to be like in their top 3 titles that they already like for them to make a purchase. Right. After that, you're relying on discovery, which, like we said, is a very small percentage. Yeah. So people were very often, I remember doing comic conventions, people knew about my comic. They liked my comic. I just wasn't in their top 3, and they spent their money on their top 3. And then I was, however many down the list, and they just stopped by to verbally thank me. I just wanted to say thanks for the comic. I just wanted a lot of just phrases. I just basically saying right off the bat, I ain't spending money on you. Right. I just want to say hi.
Oh my God. Can I piggyback on this? Because I just remembered something that'll make you laugh. I had a couple of I just wanted us when they came up to the booth because, and they would say it, and it's so reinforcing about my feelings about Instagram. Oh my God, you're here. I follow you on Instagram. I just wanted to say I love your comics. Well, here's the book collections. I'm happy to put a sketch in here for you to make it special for Comic-Con. Just wanted to say I love your comics. Bye. And I was like, God damn you, Instagram. You are useless. Instagram is so useless. Anyway.
Even when you get these people standing in front of you, it's almost like that inability to lingers on from Instagram. It's almost like a curse that they put on their users. They're useless online. They're useless in person. Why are you spending time building an audience here? They're cursed.
Yeah, I think at tops, I think only 2 Instagram readers came by and bought stuff. The other ones were all like, they're all very young. Oh, I love your work. And I think it's just that Instagram, Brad, in all seriousness, I know you were half joking. Instagram doesn't ingrain a culture of support. These things just appear on their feed, and it doesn't matter if they support them or not. They just keep appearing. Whereas people that grew up in different environments, whether even Twitter, but definitely online with webcomics, even Webtoons says Patreon at the bottom of every Webtoons, So you know that there is an artist behind this that's trying to make a living. But Instagram is like, la, 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 no links out. Everything's free. Yeah. No need to support an artist. And I think you're right. I think you're partially right that ingrains a certain I don't need to support this person. Just want to say thanks.
And by the way, if you disappear tomorrow, they're going to keep scrolling. They're never even going to know that you're not there. They're just going to scroll.
The algorithm makes sure that I am not a permanent loss in their heart, because there's 50 other things that take their place. Anyway, in terms of, though, I want to end the discussion of Comic-Con with one thought, which is In the cases where you do either a local web comics show or a comic show, a Comic-Con, a cartoon art festival, a book event from your library, I just want to put this thought in your mind as fellow cartoonists, that when a kid comes up to your booth and is fascinated by your comics, stop what you're doing and give that kid a sketch and do a good sketch and talk it through with them and talk about drawing with them, because that's our responsibility for the next generation of cartoonists. Is you don't know what fire you're starting in their heart. And also, that's the moment where money doesn't matter. You're just there. You have an ability, and your ability is art, and give that art to that kid. You know what I mean? Give them a free sketch and make it a damn good one, and make it fun for them and a memory for them, so that you can fire up a love of art for them at that moment. That's my one lasting thought from Comic-Con, because it happened a few times, and God, it's wonderful. And when you get the chance, that's not a selling event. That's a give a kid a good sketch and be great about it, because you are firing up a new artist in that one.
Well, and that, I mean, listen, it's always nice to get a little something for your bank account, but how nice does it feel to get a little something for your heart at that moment, you know? And you said it, you always say at these shows, you come back rejuvenated, reinvigorated. That's, I think a big part of that is the fact that you're giving a lot. And so it just bounces right back to you, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got to remember that, none of us chose a career where we're chasing the almighty dollar first. Like we're trying to make the world a little bit better with our art. And God, that's a really immediate and wonderful, and as Brad said, goes both ways, kind of a joy feeling when you can give a kid a good sketch. So that, I know it adds up to nothing, but I'm just saying, the next time you do a show, make sure you're giving kids really good sketches, and that you're making their show wonderful, because that's one of the few great things we can do with our art that is immediate, it's in person, and it makes somebody's life better. All right, Brad, well, moving us over to questions coming in from patreon.com/ComicLab, which, by the way, if you have not thought of joining us over at patreon.com/ComicLab, every week we have a bonus show called ProTips that goes out to our exclusive pals and friends over at Patreon. And Brad, how many episodes of ProTips now are there in existence that folks could download?
We've got easily, as of right now, we're 240 episodes in. I think we're recording like 240 or 241.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, I think this one is actually 242. And for every Comic Lab, there's been a Pro Tips to go along with it. So, yeah, and most of them are between 20 and 30 minutes long. They're a little bit shorter bites because we just focus in on getting you some tips and things to think about. So you've got many hours of Pro Tips to catch up on if you haven't been listening. And I got to tell you, I really enjoy being able to do Pro Tips, because it's just often it's stuff like, here's something that's going on right now that you need to know about. Here's one thing you can do right now to level up your game, to do better word balloons, to do better art, to do better writing. And we get a lot of compliments on Pro Tips, just being able to zero in on those topics, get in and get out, and get back to work.
Yeah. So in addition to when you join us over at patreon.com/ComicLab, not only are you getting the Discord and the community discussions, which are great actionable advice from fellow pros, fellow pro-ams, fellow cartoonists, and from Brad and I, but you're also getting those weekly episodes. It's a whole other podcast of Pro Tips that are all actionable bits of advice. So anyway, if you haven't joined us yet over at patreon.com/ComicLab, give it a think, because I think you're going to enjoy all the things that come with it. And I will say this, Brad, our next question comes in from Alexi over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And he says, when you guys were figuring out how to make your comics look a way you're happy with, did you find yourself sacrificing certain aesthetics for the sake of time? As artists, especially in comics, I know deadlines are important, but what kinds of things did you decide to sacrifice when drawing in order to get something done in a timely manner and also be happy with the result? Or is it just this is how it looks now, no time to go back, got to move on sort of thing? Brad, so I ask you, what have you sacrificed, Brad? What have you sacrificed?
Well, listen, this is that age-old topic in art. Is good is the enemy of done, or perfect is the enemy of done, more like it. In other words, you can spend too much time trying to get something perfect, and sacrifice just getting it done and doing the next piece.
Right.
And when it comes to comics, we've always said that comics have a commerce connection. Since the very creation of comics, it's always been about getting entertainment out on a regular basis, whether it was daily or weekly, or in the cases of comic books, monthly. You at some point, you've got to say, okay, I'm done with this now. I've got to move on.
Right.
I don't know that I could point to you anything specifically that I like gave up on. Like, in other words, you may be expecting me to say, well, I gave up on drawing backgrounds. Well, that's not really a good answer, because sometimes you need a background.
Right.
Sometimes you draw a scene without a background because it's just that's what the composition calls for, right. And that background is going to be more of a detriment than an addition. So you're always making conscious choices there. But in terms of sometimes you end up putting a whole bunch of detail into something, very often with comics, and you get halfway through and you're like, wait a minute, I'm putting detail in that no one's going to notice. Yes. Right. Yeah. And then that's when you need to back off and say, listen, this is taking up a lot of time that I could be using on something else. And by the way, if you're a digital artist, I guarantee you've done it at least once, because being digital allows us the ability to zoom way in on something, right, and start drawing every brick in the brick wall. And then you zoom out and it's just a massive gray, right? And you just created cross-hatching. Instead of a brick wall, because you've gone so small. So I don't know that I like, again, it wasn't like, well, I'm not going to be able to draw noses because I've got a time constraint. I got to move. I got no time for noses. Yeah. It wasn't that. So if you're looking for a thing, there wasn't a thing. More to the point, what it was I noticed that as I continued to go, I developed a spidey sense that said, hey, you're spending enough time on this. It's time to move on, because you're going to start getting behind. Right. You're going to start missing your deadline. What happens more often than not is you start to develop an inner stopwatch that says, you spent enough time here, time to wrap this up, move on to the next panel, time to wrap this up and move on to the next page. And you can't develop that until you've been burned by your own deadlines once or twice, or getting into those situations where you zoomed way in on what ended up being 10 pixels by 10 pixels and, absolutely obsessed over what was happening in that space. You'll develop your own sense for this. You'll develop your own inner stopwatch. And the only way to do that is to go out and do it. But if you're looking for a specific, I don't know that exists.
Yeah, I think Brad is onto the right thing here, that it's sort of a muscle memory, in that he has an internal stopwatch, unlike when he went to Michigan and had to do small talk, where he sort of forgot the internal stopwatch of like, have I done enough small talk? Do I need to keep talking about the weather? How much more do I have to mention about their shoes? Can I walk away now? Like he forgot his mental stopwatch, but because he's been doing comics the past 3 years, he's still on. No, the true answer here is that Brad is really on the right path here, and his answer is true. I think you're specifically, Alexi, asking two people who came out of a comic strip tradition. Brad's now doing page form, and I'm now doing page form graphic novels with Drive and Evil Inc. And so, but both with the comic strip version of Evil Inc. and the comic strip of Sheldon, we cut our teeth with what is probably one of the more minimalist versions of cartooning, because you had to get it out 7 days a week, which we did for many years. Yeah. And because you only have a limited amount of space. And because a third of the comic along the top is taken up by words, and so you don't have a lot of space down below. And so what I'm getting at is, we sort of started from the extreme in terms of minimalism. And so if anything, going now to Drive and to Evil Inc. graphic novel format, we've sort of been able to spread our wings a little bit more, but we're sort of having cut our teeth on the minimalist version of cartooning. I think it has given us a good muscle memory for, look, I could spend 30 minutes drawing a really good background, but this panel is really, its job is just to communicate this. And all I need is mismatched talking, and I need to show her going through the doorway and the word balloon. Those are the only 3 elements. And so Brad has this weird internal muscle memory, sort of interior editorial eye that goes, yeah, I could draw a bunch of paintings on the wall, and I could draw a trash can against the wall, and I could draw a bit of detritus on the floor or something, but that doesn't add to what this panel just needs to communicate the information, and she's walking through the door, and that's all I need to do.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you have hit the nail on the head in that I think this is you've heard me say in the past that that one of the problems with comics is that I'm going to estimate 80 or 90% of people who come to comics from an illustration background. They're fascinated with drawing as an art. They love drawing, and so they're drawn to comics because it's such a visual medium. And that's when they get tripped up because you find out very quickly that the writing is more important. Right. So if you are like 80 to 90% of the people that fall into this category, you're coming to comics from an illustration background, and you're really, really obsessed over the illustration. When you should be obsessed over A, the writing, and B, that the fact that in a comic, that panel is being skimmed over in many times less than a second, right? Your
eye is darting down for just a millisecond to look at the art.
Yep. Because they're reading the words and then they're skimming the art and going on. And you learn very quickly in comics is that wasting too much time down there with the illustration is just that. It's wasted effort, right? And Dave, you're absolutely right. Coming from this as people who were in the initial stages, comics people, we grew up. We weren't illustrators that became cartoonists. We looked at that newspaper comics page, and that's what we wanted to be. Right. So we grew up on the minimalist construction of Charles Schulz. We grew up on that minimalist. All of them. Calvin and Hobbes is very minimalist. Bloom County. Right. None of them were detail oriented like some of those early 1900s comic strips were. That's one thing that you're going to have to develop for yourself if you, like a lot of these folks, come to comics from illustration. You've got to break yourself of that. It's not about that illustration. It's about the moment. It's about that reading experience. That's what you've got to focus on, not necessarily the illustration.
And this might be a helpful way to look at it, but let's break it down 2 different ways. When you're doing either a comic strip or a comic page, you literally have to ask yourself, and so much so that Brad and I have been doing it so long that I don't even think we ask it anymore. Our brain just intuits it. But you, if you're starting, should ask this question. What does this page, what does this comic strip need to accomplish? Right? That is something you need to think about. And then when you get to an individual panel, what specific things does this panel need to communicate? Right? And that's why I was saying, like, yes, you could add a bunch of background to mismatch, or you could have her outfit has a bunch of flair, or, oh, look at this unique camera angle that took Brad forever to draw because it's got this forced perspective. But all that individual panel needed to do was communicate the word balloon of what she was about to say. It needed to communicate she was walking through a doorway, and that was it. So anything extra is extraneous. And so Brad and I and a lot of people who've been working for years and years, you kind of intuit almost right away, like this, I just need to do these 3 things. But you, if you're starting out, can literally ask yourself, what are the things that this panel, this page need to accomplish? And then get those things done. And as Brad has sometimes said in the past, then if you have time left, add a little bit extra. That's great. That's all gravy. But I would also advise this. Sometimes adding a little bit extra actually makes it less effective, because one of the things comics are is they are a minimalist art in a way. And so there's a reason why XKCD works in the same way that that a Romita comic works, is that a comic at its essence is just a communication tool. And so if you communicate, you have succeeded. You did the job. Yeah. And so sometimes adding a bunch of extra details. Oh, look at all the paintings in the background. Oh, look at the trash can against the wall. Look at the detritus on the ground. It actually confuses the reader, because they go, wait, do I need to register that as important? The mind for a split second goes, is that a critical part of what's being communicated? And it has to process it. But if it's not even there, it doesn't even have to process it. So it's an interesting dance you have to do as a cartoon artist.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, as you're talking, I'm just realizing that plays a huge role in character design, right? I get every now and again, I'll like for a Kickstarter reward, I'll have somebody can write a 5-page Eva Link story, right? And they'll say, oh, I'd like you to do this character. And they'll give me what they think the character should look like. And it's got all this detail, right? And he's got belts and whistles and bobs and boops and all this other stuff. And I'm like, none of that stuff is going to happen. Yeah. None of that. Because I got to draw it panel after panel after panel after panel. And I am going to detest this character with the things in his shoulders and the belts and the loops. Because I got to remember all of those details, panel after panel. And what happens is, well, you look at any of my characters, Mismatch, very simple character design. Lightning Lady, very simple character design. Captain Heroic, simple. Why? Because I just need to get those ideas across, right? If this was something that was going live action, all of those characters would be reimagined. But I know just from myself, I don't have a detail-oriented brain. I'm going to start dropping details, and then people are going to start pointing it out in my Patreon, and I'm going to start hating them. It's better for all people concerned. You keep that character design simple.
Yeah, I mean, the way an instructive comparison here is how film does things versus how comics does things. Because when you design a costume for a film, right? Let's say it's a superhero film, you can work for months on that, and then all the work is done. The actor puts it on. I mean, obviously there's adjustments on the scene, and they keep it up. But you get where I'm going with this: is that you design them for months and months and months, so that all the work is done. They put it on. You can do scene after scene after scene. But a cartoonist would have to redraw every one of those granulations. Like compare Multiverse of Madness when Mr. Fantastic appears. There's like 4 shades of blue fabric in his, if you look closely, there's very different types of granulated fabric on his outfit, right? Textures. The 4 is broken up itself into weird little segmented areas. His gloves, his belts, all the little tiny details that show up and pop on film. You know what you do in comics? A little bit of blue, a little circle of white, and a black 4. You're done, right? Because no one wants to draw all that bullshit. You can, and obviously for a splash page you would, but no one's going to draw that panel after panel after panel because it would drive you bonkers. It's not how comics work, you know? Yeah.
Give them a little gray at the temples to make them nice and handsome, and you're done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, to go back to simple things like Schulz or Ziggy or XKCD, if the communication of a character could literally be down to a stick figure and still work because the brain, much like Hitchcock did with his film, the brain fills in the gaps. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The reader is a co-conspirator in the creation of those comics. So you give them enough to work with, and then you let their imagination fill in the blanks.
This is a total tangent before we go to our next question, but I got to share this with you. In terms of Hitchcock, I had a portion of my story not too long ago where I had to have a villain that did something heinous, just something terrible, unforgivable. Okay. And basically I've never said what it is. I just said I had one moment of a news broadcast where the police are looking for this supervillain. It shows like a bombed out building. And basically, I think the word, the person talking was like, and after what she did to that apartment building full of families. And that's all I said.
Right.
And I've been getting emails and messages and DMs for weeks. What did she do? And I'm never going to tell them. Because just quite simply, whatever I can come up with is nowhere near as creepy, spooky, and horrifying as what they've got in their head. Because each one of them has fine-tuned their own horrible outcome, and it's way better than anything I can come up with. But just saying what she did to that apartment building full of families has them absolutely terrified. Why mess with it? I did the job. I scared the hell out of them.
On the opposite side of that emotional coin, but the same trick I've used because I have a bonding moment between, in my science fiction strip, between the captain and an alien named Nosh. He's a big Vetan thing. And anyway, they met during a bombing at a science event. There was an announcement, right? A science announcement. And some terrorists bombed the event. And I've never said why or how things went down, but they bonded because they saved one another in that event. They sort of became a mother-son relationship, right? And people were like, yeah, but what happened? I'm not going to say. I'm never going to say what that is. I know what it is, but I'm never going to say what it is because that lets the reader be a co-conspirator. And in their own mind, they fill in the blanks. And they usually fill it in the blanks with something that has emotional resonance in their life. And that way it makes it more powerful because they've tied it in with their own experience. And now they are co-writing the story with me. And so it makes it all the more powerful. And so anyway, that's why I say sometimes putting in extraneous detail, putting in too much detail, sometimes putting in just average detail makes the brain of the reader work too much to be like, is this information I need to process? Is this information that's critical? And it slows down the storytelling. And it also limits somewhat the Shakespearean black box filling in the blanks of an audience member who fills in that world with things from their own life. You know what I mean? You're opening the box and the reader is pouring all their own life experiences into that box with you. So too many details make it a little bit too specific sometimes. And I know that's a very unique way to say that, but it's sometimes it can be too specific, and letting it go broader can sometimes let the reader have a bigger emotional resonance with the moment.
Dave, I think we got time for one more question today.
We do indeed, my friend. And this comes in from Garth over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And he says, hey, Brad and Dave, let's talk vertical scroll. Vertical scroll. All right. Garth says, I hate it. It's awful for so many reasons. But as you so frequently and rightly point out, most of the web is experienced on a phone nowadays. So here's the thought experiment. If Webtoons wasn't a thing and hadn't introduced vertical scrolling comics to the masses, given just the constraints on a phone screen, would you design your comics in a vertical scroll format, or would you do something else? Would you swipe right for the next panel? Would you say slag it and tell people to read your comic on a tablet? Does your answer change if you were doing more graphic novel-driven comics rather than newspaper legacies? Thanks for your time and thoughts. Well, Garth, I really like this question because it is a fun thought experiment. If the world had gone a different way, how we would design the optimal reading experience. Brad, just out of curiosity, what would your version of the optical reading experience be?
Well, there's a couple, before I can get into that, there's a couple things we need to cover. First of all, at the risk of being pedantic, we've got to go back and adjust our language a little bit because we were described as newspaper legacies. And in comic strips, again, this is semantics. In comic strips, the idea of a legacy comic strip has a very distinct meaning. It's somebody that takes over a comic that somebody else had been doing. Like when that person came over and took over Nancy. That's now a legacy comic. Randy Milholland taking over the Sunday Popeyes. That's a legacy. We've got to adjust that a little bit. I understand what you're saying. We come from a comic strip background, but that's not a legacy. That's a little bit of a different thing. So that's point number one. Point number two, when I first read this question, I was a little bit upset because, like you pointed out earlier in the show, Dave, I haven't been doing a comic strip for, what was 2016? 6 years?
6 years ago.
I haven't been doing a comic. I've been doing a graphic novel for 6 years now. I switched over. But I realized that this is actually a huge compliment that Garth is giving me because I don't present that comic online as a graphic novel. I fine tune that comic's presentation based on what you're likely to be reading it on. And that would be either a vertical scroll if you're reading it on a cell phone. It would be a half page if you're reading it on desktop. You're not going to see that full page until you get to an ebook or the book level. Why? Because that's how I give myself that edge that I feel I need so that I can excel in each one of those areas. So the fact that Garth thinks that I'm doing a comic strip is a huge compliment to me because he's probably either reading on a phone or on a desktop, and it looks very much like a comic strip in those cases.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
It doesn't look like a graphic novel. And I feel very strongly that you need to do that. I wish more people would do it. That's why when I'm working on a page, my next page of comics, I've got to hit a specific point. I've got to have a punchline or a moment of significance at the halfway mark of that page and on the last panel of that page. Why? Because again, that's how I'm going to present it. That's how it's going to be put out in two swings, the top half and the bottom half. So it's a compliment. What Garth is saying is what I'm doing is working, because otherwise I'd be trying to put a page out. Now, how would I'm going to answer your question. I would do it exactly the way it's done right now. I think the vertical scroll is awesome. And I'll tell you why. Think about how a vertical scroll works, right? You read the top of the panel, your eyes go down, like you just pointed out in the previous segment. And then what does the scroll do? You scroll down to the next panel. Right. Well, that eye motion is continuing. It's continuing down. It's this continuing scroll. Your eye keeps going down, 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 down. You read the top of the panel, bottom of the panel, top of the panel, the bottom of the panel. If you were going side by side by side, you'd be going down, up, down, up, down, up. I get that you could kind of finesse a horizontal into there. That would be one of the great things about it. Of course, on the other hand, you're going to lose your ability to do a vertical, right? But in terms of this vertical scroll, I don't have that big of a problem with it. I actually think it's a rather graceful way to read comics because it takes into account how a traditional comics panel works.
I have to say, I appreciate you, because I did not think of in terms of eye movement previous to this. But you're right. Back in my academic days when I was doing masters in comics, I remember reading a couple of, oddly enough, science papers about eye tracking and comics, and how if you track an eyeball reading comics, what you see is horizontal, 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 quick sideways Z as the eye darts down to the art, and then back up to the next panel, horizontal, horizontal is reading the comics, and then down another sideways Z. So it's a really, if you look at it, it's a haphazard and clunky eye movement to take in comics by a traditional. I mean, it is what it is. That's 100 years of comics. That's what we all grew up with, and we don't even think about it anymore. But Brad is right to an extent that. I love being right to an extent. No, I'll give you no extent. Brad is fully right. Brad is fully right that it actually is somewhat pleasant. For those that remember, and Brad will hate that this is a reference, for those that remember Frank Herbert's Dune, the Bene Gesserit had a reading device that would flash individual words at you, and you could read like 500 times faster than the eye darting across the page. So in some respects, this is kind of like that Bene Gesserit device. And what a nerd that I bring up the Bene Gesserit. God damn it. Now I'm mad at myself because that's such a nerdy reference. You should be. That is such a, how did I get married? That is such a nerdy reference. Anyway, but you're right that it's easier on the eye. It actually is somewhat of an elegant motion of the continuous scroll. Your brain knows what to expect. The same visual space is taken up by the next thing and then replaced by the next thing and then replaced by the next thing, which is probably why I thought of the Bene Gesserit reading device. And so because your eye is not moving, the new thing is coming to you on this display panel, right? So I will agree with Brad. It actually, as much as I initially disliked it, much like you, Garth, I have come to somewhat appreciate the vertical scroll. And as I as I modify and anticipate my panel designs, I think Beth and I are getting better, me at designing them and Beth at slicing them, such that it's actually a very pleasant way to read Drive, right? Go ahead, Beth. You want to jump in?
Let's talk about this just for a second, because we did bring up the comic strip background that both of us have. Let's not treat that whole era with rose-tinted glasses, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. All throughout the newspaper dominated era of comic strips, we had cartoonists who could not stand the layout of a traditional 3 or 4 panel strip. Oh boy,
that's true. Right? Yeah.
It was too small. It was too clunky. There were space constraints. Yeah. I mean, I remember Burke Breathed, just railing about how his comic was getting
Watterson
squished.
spent the last third of his career railing about it,
Yes, none of those guys, well, very few of them. And I mean, when you go back to Charles Schulz, we'll probably be talking about this on November 12th when we're down there doing our show at the museum. But when he had to reconfigure his strip so that they could sell it in a special way. Right. So they could get a foothold. That meant he had to go even more minimalist. He had to do his lettering a different way. And all of a sudden, when he hit that sweet spot that really worked for him, all of a sudden people couldn't buy this comic strip enough for their newspapers. But he had, listen to what I'm going to say. He had to work within the constraints that were available at his time. And when he did, you didn't hear Charles Schulz sitting there pissing and moaning about the fact that he had to do that comic in a certain way. He just said, hey, here's what I need to do. Listen to this. I'm going to do it the best way I possibly can. And all of a sudden, he became Charles Schulz. Go back and look at those early Peanuts. All of a sudden, you went from, what was it called, Little Folks to Peanuts. All of a sudden, this guy exploded. How did he do it? He did it by not sitting there and fighting the system, but finding the best way to work within the system.
That is true. You had made a point about like, what, you never heard Charles Schulz pissing and moaning? I was going to be like, well, except for his entire life, you did?
Well, there was that.
But yes, your point is really well made because in some respects you have to, from sort of a pragmatic standpoint, you have to accept that the things are the way they are. Robert Crumb had to make those comics the way they did because that was just the way Haight-Ashbury could print comics back then. Schulz had to do comic strips the way he had to do them. Stan Lee and Ditko and all those guys, they had to do comics a certain way because that was the shelf space that was allowed for comics on those spinner racks, right? They couldn't suddenly be like, I want to do a horizontal, like Stan couldn't come into the office and be like, here's what we're doing. It's going to be amazing, he'd be like, shit, we got to use the same format we used in 1945, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so
they couldn't all of a sudden do 60-page comics instead of the number of pages. They were caught in a format, that page count, everything else. They were in a format.
And don't think that American cartoonists at Marvel or DC or whatever publisher weren't looking longingly over at French or Franco-Belgian albums going, damn it, I wish we could draw to that format. Look at that format. It's amazing,
Yes.
But they were stuck with what they were stuck with. And so I think what Brad and I are saying, like, I will continue to play this mind game because I would like to talk about other formats that I would like to see. But I think we all have to acknowledge that Webtoons really caught the tiger by the tail here and found a format that actually, in the history of comics, to Brad's point, kind of works really well. And I say that having studied most every aspect of comics in the last 100 years, that the vertical scroll, once you get past the newness of it, and I had this too, where you're like, this is new and I don't like it. Once you get past it, you're like, actually, this kind of works. And it actually, if you think about it, it does one thing that all comics did terrible before, which was hide the ending. It does it really well. Yeah. You can't have a spoiled panel. You can't have a spoiled page flip because a vertical scroll doesn't give it to you until you get to it. And that's amazing for comics. Cartoonists always previously had to hide either the final panel in a comic strip as best they could visually, or they had to hide an explosion or an action thing on a page flip. And vertical lets the cartoonist really do that in a much easier way. So there's a bunch of advantages we could talk about for vertical scroll, but those are just some of them.
Yeah, and after all, I've said this before, but what are you giving up? What are you giving up with a vertical scroll? You're giving up horizontals, which I get. I think horizontals can be very powerful. I think horizontals have a great use in visuals. You're giving up a horizontal. That is something that you can't gloss over. But after that, the list gets really short. What else are you giving up? Well, you're giving up non-rectangle, non-circular panels, right? So in other words, you're giving up parallelograms, right? And non-rectangles. You're giving or the other way to look at it is diagonal gutters. You're giving those up. Well, I'll be honest with you. I never was that choked up about parallelogram panels anyway. They always end up with these cute little angles in the corner that made the composition a little bit rough. right? There's a lot to be said for just a simple rectangle. Again, my opinion has been from the very beginning, nobody ever read a comic because it had a wild, wacky layouts. They're reading it for what's inside those panels.
And just to reiterate, and I want to let you keep going, but just to reiterate, that's again one of those decisions of what do I need at the bare bones to do to communicate. And the bare bones is a rectangle, a square, a shape that'll get the information across. It doesn't have to have those weird diagonals with the acute or obtuse angles there that are thrown in there. So yes, a basic square can do the job.
So now, Dave, you said that you wanted to continue the thought experiment. Did you have anything that like if like all things were equal, is there a different way you would do it?
Well, I will say this. I would like to talk about it in terms of let's just accept that vertical scroll and a handheld phone is with us probably for the next 5 to 10 years, if not 15 years at least, right?
Easily.
But
yes,
let's say someone cracks the code on something like a Google Glass or of Facebook's Meta, both of which I hate. I've tried both and I hate them. Most people hate VR. Most people hate, but we could see a world where either projected holograms on a small scale or just in front of eye projection, either on like a Google Glass type device or something that we haven't yet invented, or perhaps even an implant, somewhere in our lifetime could happen. And in that case, I'll be honest, Brad, that I would like to go back to page by page reading. I like the dance of composition of a panel against the composition of the page. I like the way that information is discreetly displayed, not discreetly like something that you're hiding, but discreetly like an individual unit of information. A page is very helpful. A page is my preferred format, and it's what I still draw to, even though I also keep an eye and a winking nod towards how I'm going to slice it for vertical now. I still design for the page. So that's for me. What about you? What if you could wave a magic wand and could have any format that you want, what would you pick?
No, I'll just reiterate. I don't think there's anything wrong with the vertical scroll, but I will say this in terms of what you just got done saying. The one thing that pops out to me is that the page is an iteration of a printed product. And what you're talking about, we're going to start to get so far away from printed products. We're already seeing a little bit of a step away from print. But as that happens, that idea of what a page is going to continue to become more and more anachronistic, to the extent that instead of breaking a comic down into a page, it might be similar to a vertical scroll, except it's a continuous scroll, maybe horizontal, but those panels are just going to keep going and going and going. It might break into units, but this idea of what a page is going to start to get more and more separated from reality as we get further and further away from print.
I don't disagree with you. The book was basically designed as a very movable, storable, easily accessible device. But the scroll worked the actual scroll, I'm talking Library of Alexandria kind of scroll, worked just fine for hundreds, if not 1,000 years before that. And we might yet return to that in a digital format. Again, a page by page eternal scroll. Again, like Library of Alexandria, not a vertical scroll, that is akin to something more, Alexandrian, and I think that would not be the worst comic ? To read. I don't know. That might be kind of cool. What's neat though, and let's just acknowledge this moment. How fun is it that comics are adjustable and malleable and experimental, and we can do that with it? Because like I'm 48 right now. How fun that we get to have kind of a second experimental stage with comics now with vertical stuff. Like to me, I will be honest, it's been a challenge to think about vertical scroll as part of my page design, but it's also fun. It's fun to be able to like try new things. And like, I love comics for that. They're so adjustable and malleable, and they'll fit in the edges of whatever the art needs. Not to be a champion of it, but comics are awesome. I love them. Comics are great. I'm sorry, Brad. I'm not going to argue about it.
You're right about the malleability, but there's one thing that's not very malleable. And
Here
we
it
have to
comes.
acknowledge
Oh my
it.
God, I hear it in the tone of his voice. I hear it in the tone of his voice.
And that's the fact that our listeners can only take so much of us in one fell swoop. And here we are at the end of another episode of Comic Lab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, who, based on his small talk in Michigan, knows how to wrap things up. He is the editor of webcomics.com, and he is the wonderful creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my good friend, the returned victoriously Dave Kellett, co-director of the comics documentary Stripped, and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com, and the purveyor of the right now going wildly successful DinoKickstarter.com, which I am very interested in looking into.
Look who's so tired from Comic-Con that he forgot to mention it. That's right, DinoKickstarter.com. And friends, I'm really proud of this book. It's going to come out beautiful. It's going to have a cloth-bound spine with a metal printing on the spine. Oh. It's going to have a built-in bookmark. It's going to have end papers that are gorgeous. It's going to be a great book. So please jump in over at DinoKickstarter.com. And I will say, the Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode and all episodes was edited by the ever-wonderful Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
Speaking of being tired, we buried the lead. We're gonna have to make sure we talk about this at the top of the next show. You know what I'm gonna talk about next. If you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. By the way, do this. Hopefully I'm not gonna get burned by this. The last we checked, if you put either the word comic or comics into a podcast search at Spotify, guess who comes up number one? These guys right here. And that means that you put us there with those 5-star reviews. So if you were out there helping us out on Spotify, we want to take a moment and thank you right now, making us the top. By the way, that's over top of comics, podcasts about Spider-Man, podcasts about Batman. You put comics in, you get Comic Lab, and thank you to our listeners that made that happen.
Absolutely. And you know now, Brad, that based on Murphy's Law of self-promotion, the very fact that we just said we're number one means we just dropped to number two. So but anyway, do go over to Spotify and drop a 5-star review for Comic Lab. It makes a huge difference, and it's growing like wildfire there. So thank you. And I will say Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/comiclab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice, patreon.com/DinoKickstarter.com.
That's wonderful. Even like calling it Peanuts. He pissed and moaned about the title. Yeah. It's a really, I got to go back and find the quote, but they asked Gary Larson of The Far Side if he liked or disliked the title that the Syndicate picked for The Far Side. And he said something to the effect of, my friends, they could have called that comic, Uncle Nutsy's Fun House of Horrors, and I would have still been thrilled to be doing that comic. He was like, I don't care what they called it. It was an amazing experience. To his dying day, Schulz was pissed off about them calling that Peanuts.
Brad, he was still pining for the redheaded girl that he dated never in Michigan or Minnesota or whatever it was.
Hey, don't conflate those two cartoonists.
Minnesota, Michigan. It's all cold M's. It's all cold M's up there.
Hey, but Dave, I mean, you remember what Susan McTaggart had to say about pissing and moaning.
Brad, I do remember what. God damn you for putting me on the spot. I do remember what Susan McTaggart used to say about pissing and moaning. Hello, friends. Susan McTaggart here, author of the new book, Brighter Day, Brighter You. And I'm here to tell you about pissing and moaning. Remember, friends, you can piss and moan, but don't piss when you moan.